Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to look at Chapter 18 in terms of OB procedures using the ICD-10 PCS coding system. The slide deck for these use your text and your PCS code book so you're able to follow along and these procedures will make more sense to you. So let's take a look at the slide deck. Okay, and up to this point, we've been looking at some root operations, the same type of structure, the same 7 characters, but these tables you'll note are a little bit more OB specific. So one of the things that we see which puts some people off is mentioned in guideline C.1, which is the term products of conception. So a lot of these procedures are performed on the products of conception. And these are things that we think of them as being performed on the pregnant female, right? But then we have to look at the appropriate body part, and that's where that terminology comes in. So we're talking about things related to the fetus, the placenta, amniotic sac, and what have you. So this is one of the things that drives you to the guideline C.2, and these are procedures following a delivery or an abortion, right? So for procedures performed after delivery or an abortion, like removing retained products, postpartum curettage, what have you, these are still coded to the obstetric section. But what gets a little confusing, if a D&C is done at another time, in other words, outside the context of immediately after the delivery, it's coded in the medical surgical section and it's using the root operation of extraction. So you have to read a lot, the actual note and make sure that you have the correct context. Now we're going to start breaking down these PCS codes character by character, starting with character number 1, right? And instead of 0, like we'd use for the medical surgical section, we're going to be focusing on character 1, which is the OB section. Character 2 is related to pregnancy, and character 3 is the root operations. Same type of concepts we've seen before, but here with the root operations, it gets a little bit more OB specific. So let's take a look at that. And again, these are all summarized in table 18.3 of your text, so you may want to take a quick review. And these are also in the PCS codebook. And the root operations are such things as change, drainage, abortion, extraction, and so on, right? Repair, right? Each of these have a very specific definition, and choosing the correct root operation is the most important thing to get the correct PCS codes. These are your keys to the kingdom. If you're unclear on which root operation to use, it's always helpful to go back and ask yourself, reading the note, what are they trying to achieve? Makes what's the goal of the procedure? And usually that can guide you to the correct root operation. All right, so we covered the first 3. Let's take a look at character 4 that's summarized in table 18.4. This is the body part that's involved in the procedure. And again, this is OB specific. So instead of body parts like lung, liver, etc., we're dealing with products of conception, retained products of conception, and ectopic products of conception, right? So these could be 0, 1, or 2 as described here. Now let's take a look at the 5th character. The 5th character, just like any other PCS code, is talking about the approach, right? And just like any other PCS code, the approach is going to tell you how the procedure was performed. And we see the same types of things we've seen in other chapters: 0 for open, 3 for percutaneous, 4 for percutaneous endoscopic, and so on. So again, these are nothing new conceptually. They're just OB specific, and we're applying what we know into this kind of OB context. And if you're familiar with working your way through these different tables, it shouldn't present too much of a problem, especially after you review table 18.3. Now we're going to take a look at 18.6 for the devices. And again, this identifies if anything remains in the body after the procedure, right? So it can either be no device, which is character Z. It could be a monitoring device, which is character 3, or it could be Y for another device. And all these are summarized in table 18.6 in your text, and they're also in the PCS code books. So this is usually a little bit simpler than the other characters, but again, you have to use and check the table every time, right? Now we're almost done. We're going to move to the 7th character. And this gets a little bit confusing for some people. The 7th character, just as we've seen in other PCS codes, it's additional attributes. It could be, high, low forceps, mid forceps, all the things that you see summarized in 18.7. Some people spend time trying to memorize this table. I wouldn't recommend it. I would say just make sure you understand the content, because you're going to hopefully be doing the coding from the PCS book. And this is also laid out for you in the PCS code book. Okay, so again, just some final thoughts. Basically the same 7-character structure we've seen throughout the course with PCS. Big differences, everything is OB specific. OB coding is basically about procedures in the OB context, right? And again, some new terminology that may be OB specific, but for the most part, it should make perfectly good sense. If you're unsure about anything in this material, please go back and review table 18.3 that summarizes all the root operations in the OB context. Walk your way through table 18.4, kind of talks about the body parts that are being addressed in this chapter, and look at building the full codes, right? Again, usually you get the first 3 given to you. First, of course, being number 1 for OB, right? And then just build the codes out with the rest of the 7 characters. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Please reach out if you have any questions about any of this material, and we'll see you online. Bye now.